Rwanda, as probably many of you know, is a nation. It's not a collection of tribes. There are two population groups within Rwanda, the Hutu and the Tutsi, but we can't call them tribes because they speak a single language, a national language. They've shared a common history for longer than the United States has shared a history, more than 400 years. It's a single culture, but one where these population groups have been increasingly defined and have acquired increasing amounts of political significance in the 20th century as a result of the manipulations of politicians who in Rwanda, as in Burundi, as in many other parts of the world, find it to their advantage, either in keeping power or in trying to get power, to polarize situations and to accentuate differences in order to build themselves a more solid power base. The Tutsi in Rwanda were a ruling aristocracy in a highly structured state before the colonial period. It was a state that provided for a certain amount of mobility and for Hutu, who were 85% of the population, to have a share in power through official posts, and also through a certain amount of movement between the groups so that Hutu could become Tutsi. With the arrival of the colonial power, as often happens in these situations, the colonialists sought to rule in the cheapest way possible and to maximize the return. And to do this, they backed the Tutsi aristocracy with a great deal of power. At the same time that the Europeans brought in the machine guns, so to speak, brought in the additional sources of power for the Tutsi to make use of in ruling, they offered them incentives by the connection of Rwanda to the cash economy of the world. They offered incentives for them to exploit even more. The kinds of inherent limitations on their power that had existed in the pre-colonial period fell away with the support of Europeans and with all of the attractiveness of cash incentives, consumer goods, and things like that, so that you had both greater means to become oppressive and greater incentive to become oppressive. And throughout the colonial period, the control of Tutsi over the Hutu population became stronger and stronger, much more intense, and also geographically extended, because in the pre-colonial days, the central state had exercised only an informal control in the Northwest, for example, and the Northwest is a key region when we look at the events that are happening today. But the Europeans wanted everything right-angled, you know? They wanted it to all be the same, to be uniform everywhere. And they couldn't permit these anomalies to exist, these irregularities. So they wanted to extend the control of the central state into regions where there had been only previously a kind of loose tributary relationship. At the same time, because of their own racist conceptions, they associated themselves, they identified themselves with the Tutsi far more than with the Hutu. Now, there are physical distinctions between Hutu and Tutsi, but these are not exclusive. It's very difficult to explain this, but there's an ideal Tutsi type, there's an ideal Hutu type, and you'll have a small percentage of the population which conforms to one or the other, and then you have a lot of the population which doesn't conform clearly to one or the other, and it's not immediately apparent by looking at someone whether this person is Hutu or Tutsi. But for the Europeans, they saw an ideal Tutsi type, and they saw this person looking like themselves. They saw these people as being, quote, Europeans with black skins. And so they decided that these were the people who were born to rule. And they pared down the administrative hierarchy to make the system of rule easier for themselves to manage, and in so doing they eliminated Hutu from positions of power. Since the educational system was designed to provide a way into power for worthy members of the elite, they also excluded Hutu from most higher education because they were only interested in preparing Tutsi to exercise positions of power in the colonial administration. They also introduced a system of written record keeping, which made the kind of mobility from one group to another much more cut down considerably on this kind of mobility, because now everyone was inscribed from the moment of birth as Hutu or Tutsi. You took the category of your father, so if you happened to be the child of an intermarriage, this might mean you looked like your mother, but you had your father's category, which contributes to the confusion as to what a Hutu or Tutsi looks like. But they introduced this system of written records. People were required to carry identity cards. This is a practice which continues until this very minute in Rwanda. On this card, it's indicated Hutu or Tutsi. And on some of the television footage of the atrocities that are happening in Rwanda today, you can see members of the militia armed with their machetes standing by the side of the road, checking identity cards as people go by. And those people who have Tutsi written on their identity cards are sorted out to be killed. The 21 children in the orphanage who were killed day before yesterday were sorted out. It was known that they were Tutsi because that was on their identity cards. So this is a carryover of the colonial administration that since independence the Rwandan government had continued. In the mid-1950s, the Belgians, who were the colonial administrators, switched horses, and they decided to back the Hutu instead of the Tutsi. Some say this was because they wanted to prolong the colonial period, and since the Tutsi were quite anti-colonial, they figured that by backing the Hutu they could delay the arrival of independence. There are others who say, well, no, they just realized that they couldn't possibly end the colonial period with power still in the hands of a very small minority, and so they decided to open up the system, admit more Hutu to higher education, create a modified electoral system, and allow more Hutu to have positions in the administrative hierarchy. This was enough to panic some of the Tutsi, but not enough to satisfy the Hutu. So you had the breeding ground for a revolution. In 1959, the revolution began, and the monarchy was overthrown. About 20,000 Tutsi were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were driven into exile in the surrounding countries. There they stayed until October 1990. They made several efforts to come back by force and were driven back. And then in October 1990, they organized themselves, or in the preceding months, they organized themselves into the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and they invaded Rwanda on October 1st. At that time, power was in the hands of Juvenal Habyarimana, who had been a military figure who had taken power in a military coup in 1973. So at that point, he'd been in power nearly 18 years. Initially, he was a Hutu, a member of the majority group in Rwanda. Initially, he had been rather well received throughout the country and had gotten a lot of acclaim from foreign observers as well, because it seemed he was talking a rhetoric of national unity and so on. But as the years went by, as often happens when people have an unlimited expanse of power to play around with, he became increasingly focused on the desires of and the needs of himself, his own family, and his own region. His popularity dwindled in other parts of the country. At the same time, there were some economic problems, for example, a drastic decline, 50% fall in the price of coffee, which was the major export of Rwanda. So there was tough sledding economically as well. A growing dissent, growing dissatisfaction among the people in Rwanda, just at the time of this invasion. Well, the invasion offered itself to him as an ideal opportunity to try to rebuild his slipping power base by using an us versus them kind of mentality. So immediately after the invasion, 3 days after, he began a long campaign, which culminated on April 6th, of pinpointing Tutsi within Rwanda as enemies, as accomplices of the RPF, the force that had invaded, so that people who themselves had had no connection whatsoever with the invaders were now targeted as a kind of fifth column, a set of people who were going to work from within to destroy the country. 3 days after the invasion, he staged an invasion, a mock attack on the capital, which was extremely successful. He was a master of political theater, Habyarimana was, and he persuaded both the foreign diplomatic community and the correspondents who were present in Rwanda that the capital had actually been attacked by the RPF, when in fact the RPF was still miles and miles away. It was his own army that was firing in the air for a number of hours during that night. When morning came, he used this as a pretext to claim the need for foreign assistance from abroad, and he got it. A few months after this, I talked to an officer in the Rwandan army, and I said, "What happened the night of October 4th? Oh, he said, "That was fireworks to welcome our friends, the French." And in fact, that's what it was. It was a conscious ploy to draw in French and Belgian and Zaïrois troops to support his regime. Eventually, not too long after, the Belgians and the Zaïrois caught on and they left, but the French stayed and stayed and stayed, to Habyarimana's great benefit. The other advantage to him in staging this mock attack on the capital was it gave him a pretext for moving against the internal opposition which had been developing. So the next morning he began arresting people, and over the next couple of weeks he had between 8,000 and 10,000 people in jail in deplorable conditions without charge for up to 6 months at a time. A certain number of these people died from the effects of torture, poor sanitation, and the poor conditions. The others were eventually released after international pressure. 2 weeks after that, he had the first massacre of the Tutsi. It was an event that attracted relatively little attention abroad, but his government officials incited and organized an attack in the commune of Kibirira, where approximately 300 Tutsi were killed. Now, when I investigated this incident as part of an Africa Watch mission, and later as part of an International Commission on Human Rights Abuse. When I went around and talked to the victims, I was told by a number of them that this had been so clearly organized by government officials that it had been designated the work obligation of the month for the people of that commune. And another carryover from the colonial period was the practice of umuganda, which meant 1 day free labor a month given to the community. It was an obligation for all citizens. You planted trees, or you worked on the road, or you built a school. Well, for that month in Kibirira, the umuganda was to kill Tutsi. Now, my profession is history, and particularly oral history, and I thought, well, I know the value of symbolic speech. I know that what's meant here is really, this is a statement which tells me that, yes, government officials were involved. This is not an actual statement that government officials told people that it's their duty this month as their work to go out and kill. Surely that's not the case. That was my initial conclusion. But the day after that, I interviewed some of the accused killers. And I found that, in fact, that was the case. And they said, we wouldn't have killed except the burgomaster said that this was our work for this month. This first massacre was followed by 3 others up through January 1993. Altogether, they took a toll of about 2,000 victims. Most of them were Tutsi, but some of them were members of the Hutu political opposition. The targeting of Tutsi as accomplices, as enemies of the nation, became generalized to include also all those Hutu who were willing to work with Tutsi and who are willing who wish to oppose the continuance in power of this small group around Habyarimana. Eventually, Habyarimana, under foreign pressure, had to open up his government and to permit a multi-party system. A coalition government was created, and this government proceeded to negotiations with the RPF that ended finally in a peace accord last August. On one side of the table, you had the Rwandan government, which was comprised of Habyarimana and his immediate followers, and members of the internal political opposition. On the other side of the table, you had the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which had invaded. The Rwandan Patriotic Front was largely Tutsi. The internal opposition was both Hutu and Tutsi. The peace accords were signed under enormous international pressure. Habyarimana had been told if he didn't sign, there would be no more foreign aid. And this is a significant point when we come to what our strategy is now, how our strategy is taking shape to try to deal with this crisis. At that point, the international community was able to get it together, the World Bank, the United States, France, Belgium, Germany, Canada, all the major donor countries got together and said to Habyarimana, if you don't have this peace treaty signed by August 9th, no more international money. Rwanda is an extremely poor country, one of the poorest in the world, and is very, very heavily dependent upon foreign assistance. Obviously, with that kind of pressure, he signed. But he signed knowing that he would be able to find ways to refuse to implement. So again, this master of political theater appeared to be conceding, appeared to be willing to share a considerable part of his power with the opposition and with the RPF, agreed to this arrangement of a transitional government, but at the same time determined on a plan which would keep it all from becoming actuality. Over the next months, there were many efforts made to put this tripartite transitional government into effect, and none of them succeeded. The final attempt was supposed to be on April 5th, and on April 6th there was the plane crash. April 5th was the deadline because there had been a UN peacekeeping force put in to implement the peace accords of Arusha, and this group's mandate was supposed to run out on April 5th. And at that point, the international powers said, hey, look, it's been long enough. If you don't have this government in power by April 5th, we're not going to renew the mandate for the peacekeepers. Well, in fact, April 5th came, no transitional government, and they renewed the mandate anyway, which is one more example of his success in bluffing this situation out. We have to acknowledge at the same time that the members of the political opposition themselves contributed to the failure of the process by allowing themselves to be splintered and by falling apart internally as they got closer and closer to power. There were a lot of power struggles within the opposition, and that made it easier for Habyarimana to execute this delaying tactic from one deadline to the next. Within an hour of the plane crash, there were barricades on the roads around the capital city, and the killings had begun. Clearly, the plane crash itself was only a pretext to put into execution a plan which had been developed over a period of months and systematically prepared for. It was a plan to eliminate the Tutsi and the members of the internal opposition. The plan included, first of all, a highly targeted and organized propaganda campaign. At the start, this campaign was carried out over the national public radio. There's only one radio station at that point in Rwanda, and this radio station was key at the time of one of these massacres that I mentioned of Tutsi in a place called Bugesera in March 1992. The national radio was the agent for provoking people, inciting them, getting them ready to kill Tutsi at that point. Now, Habyarimana was a man who was able to adjust his tactics very quickly to the situation. At some point, he realized that he was attracting a lot of bad press for this kind of behavior. And Monique and the people who worked with her were being extremely successful in building human rights organizations within Rwanda. And at the same time, international organizations also were beginning to criticize this kind of behavior. So Habyarimana did two things. He privatized the violence, and he privatized the radio station. It was a concept that could appeal to people in Washington, right? You move it out of the public domain, you shift it away from yourself, you remove yourself from responsibility for what's happening. And he did this on one level by creating militia organizations attached to first his own political party, the MRND, and then eventually a closely allied and even more extreme party, the CDR, which was created. Now, when we approached Habyarimana at one point and discussed these militia and said, what is this? You've got these young people whom you're training to kill, whom you're arming, and so on and so forth. Not so. He said, no. He said, you have it wrong. It's just like the Boy Scouts, right? It's a youth group of young people who get together to support our party. But in fact, these groups were involved in Bugesera, in killing Tutsi, and then later, even more clearly, in December 92 and January and February 93, these militia began to replace the role that had previously been played by the official government spokesman. So that instead of having the local burgomaster who was organizing some of these massacres, you had the leaders of these militia, the Interahamwe, who began to play an increasingly important role. Then, when people reproached Habyarimana with the killings, he would say, oh, not me. This was somebody else. This had nothing to do with my administration. It was a private initiative, right? The same way, a private radio station was established by supporters of the CDR, and this radio station then took up the worst of the incitements to violence and the worst of the hate-filled propaganda that had been on the national radio, so that it then removed this one step away from Habyarimana. This radio, which is still operating today, is called the Radio of the Thousand Hills, because Rwanda is known as the country of the Thousand Hills. This radio, increasingly over the last 6 months, broadcast statements about Tutsi as a group, about members of the political opposition, about how they were traitors to the country, how they should be killed, how this was the appropriate way to deal with them, how Hutu needed to defend themselves by whatever means necessary. They also targeted individuals like Monique. And the way they did that was they would play popular music, songs from Zaire, songs from Rwanda, that had the woman's name Monique in the lyrics. And when the song would finish, the announcer, the DJ would come on and say, we've got a woman named Monique in our country as well, but she's clearly a different kind of person. She's a traitor. She's a traitor to our country. She deserves to die in the most awful way possible, and we're sure it's going to happen. This kind of thing went on throughout the month of March, and Monique reported this to us. At the same time, there was an intensive training program for the militia. Increasing numbers of young people were recruited into these groups, and groups of 300 at a time were sent to a military camp in northeastern Rwanda in Mutara to be trained by members of the elite Presidential Guard, Habyarimana's own special division of the army. By late March, the whole process was so clear to members of the political opposition and to human rights activists like Monique that they were giving us clear signals of alarm. Monique sent us a fax at the end of March that said there are 1,700 young men being trained in militia camps, they're being armed with guns, grenades have been distributed to them, there is going to be a systematic effort to wipe out the political opposition. 2 days after that, I had a phone call from a highly placed member of government who didn't realize that Monique had been in communication with us, but someone who was in the government but who was a member of the opposition. He gave me exactly the same message. So when that plane went down, it didn't take Monique or many others long to realize that this was the pretext for putting this plan into effect. Now, how did the plane come down? Was it an accident? Unlikely. It seems almost certain it was shot down. Who shot it down? Well, the RPF was not in that immediate vicinity. He was shot down, the plane was shot down by Rwandan army fire. It could have been that it was shot down by military who were associated with the internal opposition, who were just impatient with all the delays and figured there was no way to bring this to a conclusion except to get rid of Habyarimana. More likely, it was shot down by his own people from the location from which the rockets seemed to have left the ground. Why would his own people shoot him down? Well, presumably either because they were afraid he was finally going to weaken and give away some of this precious power, or because someone was just ambitious to take over for him. Figured the old man was getting tired after 20 years and someone else would take the reins of power. Whatever the cause, the pretext worked and the plan was put into effect and the killing began.